Hi, welcome to the study of the Gospel of Matthew. You should have been able to download the syllabus off of the Bear Valley Bible Institute website. Is there anybody that hasn't yet done that? Okay. Well, on there, be sure you do that and then have the syllabus available, because I'll be making reference to various things from that in class. Basically, the way this class is going to work is as follows. We will have 13 study sheets that is on the CD that is being passed around, but is also a part of the syllabus. Those 13 sheets basically comprise two parts of your final grade for the class. One is just doing the sheets. Now, I'm going to begin every class by asking you if that sheet has been completely filled out. If you got 3/4 of it done, the answer is no. If you got 90% of it done, the answer is no. It's not completely filled out. 100% of the sheet needs to be filled out in order for you to get full credit. Then, there's a possibility that we'll start class with the pop quiz. The pop quiz will be over whatever sheet was assigned for that day, plus the previous one before that. So as far as studying for quizzes, there are 2 sheets most of the time that you're going to be responsible for studying. All right, so for Thursday, sheet number 1 needs to be filled out, and be ready for a possible quiz. Obviously, we don't have a sheet before that, so you're just responsible for the questions on sheet number 1. I'll begin class on Thursday by asking you individually if you got the sheet completely done. And so that's the way that it will work for every class period that we have a sheet that's assigned. We actually have a few more class periods than we have sheets, and so there'll be a couple of days that you'll not have any sheets to fill out. But most of the time, there'll be one sheet that needs to be done. So now, there have been some that have said that filling out these sheets and the 25, 26 questions or whatever is taking 3, 4, 5 hours to do. You're spending, if that's taking you that long, way too much time. We're not looking for some long, extended answers on these things, but it should be something that the questions are basically in the order of the text, and you should be able to just work through the text, answer the question. Generally, it's a short answer. Sometimes it's just one word, but you shouldn't be spending any more than, say, an hour, maybe an hour, 15 minutes max in filling out one of those sheets. If you're taking longer than that, then you're probably overthinking it and doing more work than what I really had in mind with those sheets. All right, so the quizzes will be 25% of your grade. The filling out the sheets will comprise another quarter of your grade. Then we have 2 tests, 2 major exams in this class. One will be after we complete Matthew chapter 12. So if you're wondering when is the midterm going to be in this class, it'll be when we finish chapter 12. So you can just kind of gauge on how we're doing there. And then second test will be over chapters 13 through 28. It will not be a comprehensive test. So once we finish the first 12 chapters, I'm not going to ask you any other questions about the text of Matthew chapters 1 through 12. So that's basically what kind of work that we're doing in this class. Anybody have any questions about that?
Just looking at question sheet number 12 as an example, it says, know the parable of the 10 virgins. What would you have us fill out for that?
Yeah, there are a few of those, and just don't write anything down. Just kind of review the parable. be familiar with it, and that's really. Yes.
Did you say anything about the notebook? We're supposed to be taking notes and turning.
Yes, thank you. Notebook is another part of the grade. Actually, it's 20% of it as we break everything down. The notebook is that which. This is what I'm looking for, is a good, usable resource after you leave this class. You graduate from Bear Valley, you go into your first work, and think, well, what would be a good class for me to begin with in teaching the adult Bible class? Well, you might choose Matthew, and hopefully your Matthew notebook is going to be one of your primary resources of information in teaching that class. So I'm looking for how well organized you have your notebook, how good a job you did on taking down notes. If all you've got down is what's on the PowerPoint screen, you won't get a good grade on your notebook. I try to put the screen up, give everybody a fair amount of time to get down what's on the PowerPoint, and then we talk about it. And so the tendency is to think, okay, I got that screen down, and then to relax and disengage the brain and all that. But don't do that. There's notes that I have that I'm giving in addition to what's on the PowerPoint screen. So keep on typing. The best notebooks are those that on every page have what chapter it is that you're studying. There's nothing that's more frustrating to look through a big old stack of paper and I'm trying to find chapter 8 and I open it up and it's verses 5 and 6. Okay, what chapter is that? Well, I got to go back several pages and it's chapter 20. So then I have it broken down. Those of you that can copy the text and actually put it in and take notes underneath each verse, those are always the best kind of notebooks. But anyway, that's what the notebook grade is going to be. Every once in a while you'll see me write something down, and I'm making a note to myself that's going to be one of the verses that I'm going to grade. I know how much material I gave you on a particular verse. Say Matthew 7:21. We spent quite a bit of time talking about Matthew 7:21. Well, I'm going to pick about 20, 25 verses over the course of our study, and that's what I'm going to look at in your notebook and see how good a job you did on taking notes on that. Now, submitting the notebook, it's due on the day of the final exam, and you can get it to me one of two ways. You can send it to me electronically, or if you want to produce a hard copy and submit that, you can. But we're kind of saving trees these days, and so you don't have to print it off. You can if you want to, though.
Can we do that through email, or do you want us to do it through
Email.
did.com?
Yeah, do it through email. Okay, any other questions? All right, let's go ahead and get started. We don't have the PowerPoint? Okay. Do we want to play with it, or? Those of you that weren't able to get the sheets to, just do your best today, but know that I'm going to get this material to you probably this afternoon, or it might do it tomorrow. But anyway, I'll get it to you. All right, let's talk about some introductory material, not specifically to Matthew, but to the Gospels in general. And talking about the languages of the Bible. One language that you'll see in the New Testament at the time of Jesus is Aramaic. How many saw the movie that Mel Gibson produced, The Passion of Christ? Just about everybody. Well, that particular movie was in Aramaic with English subtitles, and the idea was that which was very Catholic in nature. The Catholic Church wants people to believe that the New Testament was originally written in Aramaic, and that was the language that was spoken on the street when Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount. He preached it in Aramaic, and so on. Now, you can see that Matthew 5:22, and when Jesus said from the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, that was Aramaic. Jesus did speak some Aramaic, but there is no true evidence, and the majority of the scholars do not believe that when Jesus went and preached on the hills of Judea that he was speaking Aramaic, but instead was speaking Greek, and that the Gospels were those that were originally written in Greek. But the Catholic Church wants to believe that the Gospels were written in Aramaic and then were eventually translated into Greek, and thanks to them, we have the Greek copies of the Gospels that they basically saved the day by preserving these Greek copies of the Gospels. Well, we have Greek copies of the Gospels that go all the way back into the early 2nd century, and they're the idea of there being Aramaic Gospels, there's just no evidence for that. Plus, you have to wonder why when Jesus said, Eli, lama sabachthani, why the people at the foot of the cross didn't understand what he was saying. If everybody was speaking Aramaic, why did they think he's calling for Elijah, and what was he saying? Well, that's because Aramaic wasn't spoken by everybody, but Greek was. And so, the common language spoken by all was Greek. Greek was the language that was the universal language beginning with the empire of Alexander the Great. So from the 300 BC down through the time of the 1st century, Greek was what people spoke. Now, if you wonder where Aramaic came from, Aramaic came from the days that they were captive in Babylon. That was the language of Chaldea, and so people during the 70 years that they were in captivity in Babylon learned Aramaic. And then a third language is Hebrew. Limited to those that had time to study it. Usually those that spoke Hebrew would have been the professionals, those that had time to study it. And so we're talking about the priests and the scribes. They would have known Hebrew, but the common people didn't know Hebrew. All right, let's move into a second category, and that is marriage. Marriage in the time of Jesus was decided by fathers and mothers. And they had this thing that they called betrothal. I'll spell it for you. B-E-T-R-O-T-H-A-L. Betrothal. Now, a lot of Bible teachers and a lot of preachers through the years have made a mistake by saying that the betrothal was like our engagement. Well, there are some similarities, but there are a lot of significant differences between our engagement and their betrothal. The betrothal was something that was a strong enough commitment that it required, according to Mosaic law, a bill of divorce in order to break off a betrothal. That's according to Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 23 and following.
Denny, can you give that scripture reference one more time?
Yeah, Deuteronomy 22, verses 23 and 24.
So do you think that we kind of took that, the meaning behind the betrothal, and kind of put it into where we are engaged to somebody before we marry them?
Yeah, it has its roots in ancient Jewish practice, for sure. Well, when Joseph found that Mary was with child, he determined to put her away. He was going to give her a certificate of divorce, even though they were not married, but they were betrothed to each other. And so in Matthew 1, verse 19, that's what we're seeing there. Now, the betrothal period was begun with a feast. When the couple announced their intention to get married, then they would have a party. And the betrothal would last for 1 year. And at the conclusion of that 1 year, then they would have a marriage ceremony that was again consummated with a feast that would last 1 week long. Those people like to party. Now, if you're thinking about John chapter 2 and the wedding at Cana, you have a good idea as to the way that worked. Now, it was a week-long feast, and what was the problem that was encountered with that particular wedding feast in John 2? They ran out of wine. Well, there are some that have suggested that they were not really expecting Jesus to bring his 12 buddies with him, and that kind of tapped the resources a little bit more quickly than they had originally planned. Well, whether that's true or not, we don't know, but we do know that they ran out. Well, you can kind of understand how that might happen, but it was a very embarrassing situation for the hosts of that particular wedding feast, who were expected to plan on feeding and providing drink for all of the wedding guests for 7 days. Now, that's a pretty daunting task, but anyway, that's the way that it was done in the first century. Also, the host, and this is for wealthier families, would provide the guests with robes. So when you went to the actual ceremony, the actual, the main feast, you didn't have to worry about dressing up because the appropriate garments were going to be provided at the door. Now, knowing this little tidbit of information definitely changes the way that you understand one of the parables of Jesus. Look in your Bible to Matthew 22. Yes.
Are there any Old Testament pictures of this? Do you have any Old Testament examples?
No, because generally in the Old Testament it wasn't quite as elaborate as it became by the time
Developed.
we get to the New Testament. All right, so Jesus is telling the parable of the marriage feast, and he tends out his slaves to call those invited to the wedding feast, verse 3, and they were unwilling to come. So he sends his slaves out, verse 4, tell those who have been invited, behold, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fatted livestock are all butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they paid no attention and went their way, one to his own farm, another to his business. And the rest seized his slaves and mistreated them and killed them. The king was enraged and sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire. Then he said to his slaves, the wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main highways, as many as you find there, invite to the wedding feast. And those slaves went out into the streets and gathered together all they found, both evil and good, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. But when the king came in to look over the dinner guests, he saw there a man not dressed in wedding clothes. And he said to him, friend, how did you come here without wedding clothes? And he was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, bind him hand and foot, and cast him into outer darkness. In that place there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. All right, so when I was a child and I read this, it puzzled me greatly because I thought, first of all, you send the slaves to get anybody and everybody, including the poor people off the streets. And so you've got some poor guy that comes in off the streets, and he doesn't have a tuxedo. He doesn't even have a suit. And so now the king's looking over the wedding guests, and he sees this guy, and he gets all ticked off that he's not dressed nice. I thought, well, duh. What'd you expect? Of course he's not going to be. He's a poor guy. But what I didn't understand, and what is principal to this parable, is that the garments were provided at the door. And the guy rejected the garments and determined to go into the wedding feast without putting on the garments that were provided. Now, the application of this is powerful. There are those that want to get into God's heaven without being cloaked with righteousness. And that's not going to happen. Unless you're wearing the robes that are dipped in the blood of Christ, then you're not going to be a part of the wedding feast. Now, there are those that want to establish their own righteousness and do it their own way, but there's only one way. So the point, then, of the parable is that we've got to do it God's way. And the way that we become a part of the feast is not the way the Jews wanted it to be or thought it should be, but the way that they wanted it to be. All right, and then, according to, yes?
Okay, I just want to touch on that for a minute. You're talking about being clothed in the blood of Christ. For that garment. If you are baptized into Christ, that's where you put that clothing on, isn't it?
Right. Galatians 3:27 says exactly that.
Galatians 3:27.
Right. Now, also according to Mosaic law, a newly married man was exempt from military service. That's Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 5. Deuteronomy 24 verse 5, and also I jot down Deuteronomy 20 and verse 7. So whenever it looked like the nation was going to go into war, there was a rash of marriages all of a sudden.
Is that betrothed? I mean, or was that married?
A betrothed man was exempt from military service. All right, let's move into another category by way of introduction related to the last one, but we'll look at it individually, and that's the home. In the first century, they always favored boy babies. Why would you surmise that that was the case?
Work and provide.
Work? What was that?
They can provide.
Yeah. So they were the breadwinners for the family. What else?
Carry on the name.
Yeah, they'd be able to carry on the family name. What else?
Didn't someone have to pay big amounts for the guys, for their daughters to marry them? Or am I thinking
The dowries from the.
Dowries were the daughters. So it was, you didn't pay for the guys, but you paid for the girls.
They were just second-class citizens overall.
The daughters? Yeah.
Well, the men were also back then, they were held responsible for how they raised up their children. Is that correct in learning that?
Yeah, that wasn't necessarily why they wanted boy babies, but that was true as far as the culture is concerned.
They provide protection for the family and the nation.
They did what?
Provided protection.
Yeah, protection both for the family and for the nation. They did not have women in the military back in those days, and so lots of boy babies would provide protection for the family as well as for the nation. Now the fourth one, the fourth reason why they wanted boy babies was unique to the first century, and that is because of a prophecy in Daniel that when they calculated Daniel's 70 weeks, they were able to project within a reasonably small window of time when what was going to happen. Yeah, the Messiah was going to come. And so women in the first century wanted boy babies because they were hoping that maybe their child was going to be that prophesied Messiah. Now there was in the first century deep reverence for old age. It was a radically different culture than ours today, where youth is glorified and basically worshipped, and old people are basically put on the shelf. In the first century, you look forward to getting old because that came with it honor, and you had wisdom, you had respect, and there was a great reverence that was bestowed to those who were old. Yeah.
The prophecy in Daniel, do you know where that is exactly?
Daniel chapter 9. Now, they would give thanks before eating meals. It was just part of the common practice to always offer thanks. And it's interesting that in all of the recorded times in the Bible where Jesus ate, it always records that he gave thanks before he ate. Even with the feeding of the 4,000 and feeding of the 5,000, Jesus gives thanks before meals. Meals in the first century were a family get-together. Even though during the day they would scatter to their various responsibilities, whether they were farmers or merchants or whatever, but they would have meals together, and at formal meals, they would recline. Normally, they would sit, or maybe they would sit on the floor, what we call Indian style, upright. But if it was a formal meal, they would all lay down on one elbow, and they would make, if you can visualize this, a U shape where you're laying down like that, and it would go halfway around, and then those on the far side of the U would lay on their right arm. When we read about Jesus identifying one of those that was going to betray him, they were all confused as to who that might be, and Peter motions to John who's he talking about? And the text says that John leaned back on Jesus' breast and said, Lord, who is it? Well, visualize, they're all reclining, it's a formal meal, and John basically did one of these. He leaned back, said, Jesus, who are you talking about? So if you visualize the way it was laid out, you can kind of see what was going on with that. So, formal meals, the reason they made the U shape was so that servants could come in and they could individually serve each person. Now, you might jot down Luke 9, verse 14, as an example of that.
What was that again?
Luke 9:14. All right, we want to talk about the religious literature of the first century. Ethan, is that my cup?
No, but you can have a drink in my cup. Yours is behind your screen.
Behind your
Behind your
laptop.
screen like this.
Like
You can
right
have-
here, behind your laptop.
Does it make me get in better favor?
No, what
All right.
help you? All right. First of all, there was this collection of writings. It was called the Talmud, Talmud.
Can you spell that again?
Talmud. This was a discussion and explanation of the Old Testament.
A discussion of the Old
A
Testament?
discussion and an explanation, kind of like a commentary on the Old Testament. Now, this was considered equal to the text itself. The Talmud was. So it had equal authority with, say, the book of Exodus, the text in Exodus. The Talmud was what taught that circumcision was equal to all the commandments of the law. Just by way of illustration. The Old Testament never said that. But by the time you get to the days of Jesus and the apostles, the Jews believed that circumcision was equal to all of the commandments of the Old Testament. In other words, that even if you broke all the laws of Moses and were still circumcised, you're still good. You're still saved.
No wonder Paul has such a problem with that.
Yeah. And you can see why circumcision became such a big deal. But there are even some references about Abraham sitting by the gates of hell, and he's just letting the Gentiles slide right on through. We care less about them. But every time there's a Jew that's sliding down toward the gates of hell, Abraham's right there to grab them and save them. And the reason he does that is because they were circumcised. So they're not going to be lost because of that.
That seems to be like a modern day example of that would be the Baptist once saved, always saved. Kind of accept Jesus into your heart and then you're good.
You're locked in.
Yeah.
That's not right.
Some Church of Christ people, though, baptism.
Double problem
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah, once I've done that, I'm good to go.
Don't have to do anything.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about names. Names were very important in the first century. Today we just think, that sounds pretty cool. But you named someone either because of that was the name of his father or grandfather, or because there was something significant about the child, maybe in demeanor or in looks, that made you want to name the child that. That's why when you're reading in the first chapter of Luke, and when everybody is wanting to know the name of John the Baptist, Zacharias tells them that his name is John. They're going, what's up with John? There's nobody in your family named John. It didn't make sense to them that he would be named John. But anyway, sometimes they would name a child according to the way the child looked, like Esau was red, and so they named him Red. In the book of Ruth, Ruth was married to a guy by the name of Chilion, and his brother Mahlon. Mahlon means sickly. So apparently, when Mahlon was a young child, he just was sick all the time. And Chilion means failing. And the best we can understand is that it has to do with being clumsy. And so maybe that's a name that kind of got attached a little bit later. But Mahlon means sickly. Mahlon, come out and play. No, I'm not feeling too good. But names meant something.
Do you think they had different names when they were younger, and then if they displayed that characteristic, they changed it to Mahlon?
Sometimes, or sometimes a name was changed by, like Jesus changed Peter's name, and that's the declaration of authority whenever you would do that.
You spell Mahlon?
M-A-H-L-O-N.
But you guys. Mine has a silent B in it. I don't know. Chilion?
Chilion, C-H-I-L. Okay, C-H-I-L-I-O-N. Yeah.
And what did Chilion mean as well?
Chilion means failing. All right. The customs related to a birth were as follows. A child was redeemed by paying 5 shekels. Now, redeemed is the idea that the child doesn't really belong to you. The child belongs to God. And so the 5 shekels was paid in order for you to buy back or to purchase your child. Now, that's about $4 in today's currency, so you can see it wasn't a lot of money. If it was a boy baby, the 5 shekels was paid to the priest, and then the priest had the responsibility of circumcising the baby. Now, one of those strange anomalies in God's law that sometimes we not quite sure why it is the way it is, but if she had a boy baby, then she needed 40 days in order to be pure. If she had a girl baby, she needed 80 days for her purification.
And that's for the mother to become pure again?
Right.
Okay.
Boy baby, 40 days. Girl, 80 days.
You say that was like a purification time?
Yeah. You read about that in Luke 2, when Mary is going to the temple after her days of purification. Then she's offering a pair of turtle doves, and that's was what the law required at the end of that period of purification.
If it was a boy and it took 40 days, what counted for the circumcision after 8 days? And was that a purification process too, or?
No, that was something by law that was to be done on the 8th day, so.
Okay, and that didn't have anything to do with the
Purification.
Okay. Strictly by law then on the circumcision.
Yeah, on the 8th day. Leviticus 12 is the passage that you want to write down, verse 1 and following. Basically, the whole bulk of the chapter discusses this part of things.
Did you say chapter 12?
Yeah, Leviticus chapter 12. All right, training. Let's talk first about the training of Hebrew boys, Jewish boys. Almost as soon as he could talk, he would learn to memorize certain portions of the Hebrew Old Testament. And by age 5, he would have the Shema memorized. Anybody know what the Shema is? Jack? Remember what it is?
If we started it, I think I could finish it.
Yeah.
The whole Shema you could?
Deuteronomy
5.
Yeah, it's Deuteronomy 6, actually 4 through 9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength. So you would expect a 5-year-old boy to be able to quote that. And as you might expect, when granddad would come, he'd ask his 5-year-old grandson, let me hear you quote the Shema. And they could do it. By age 5, they were expected to have done that. By age 10, so from the years of 5 to 10, they would be involved in studying the Pentateuch. What is the Pentateuch?
The books of law.
Yeah, it really means, Tuch is the word that means law. Penti means what? 5. So we're talking about the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which you guys are studying with Bob Turner, OT1, Pentateuch. So you'd be studying the Pentateuch, and then you would also be studying what is called the Mishnah. The Mishnah, M-I-S-H-N-A-H. The Mishnah was the oral law. The oral law, you see, the Jews believed that not only did Moses write down the 5 books of the Pentateuch, but that he also gave a large collection of laws to the elders orally, and along with the giving of those laws was a charge: you must pass these on to the next generation. And so you had a written collection and an oral collection of laws. Now those laws, these oral laws, by the time we get to the days of Jesus, the Jews have decided we need to write these down, because a lot of the elders are falling down on their job of passing these laws. And so the Mishnah was now what's called codified and recorded, and it's all in one volume, which I would strongly recommend that you purchase for your library. And this is simply called the Mishnah. And Herbert Danby is the editor of that. Now, Jesus did not agree with any authority whatsoever being given to the oral law. So that was a fabrication. It was not something that God had Moses do. And even though the Jews gave the Mishnah equal weight to the law, it didn't deserve equal weight to the law. And on many occasions, it actually was counter to the law, or it gave limitations and restrictions that God didn't want the people to have to deal with. So if you hear me make reference to the Mishnah, you'll know that I'm talking about the oral law. You know, it is amazing the similarities between what the Jews did with the written law and the oral law and what the Catholics do with the Bible and what they call the sacred tradition, the ST. And according to Catholic doctrine, the sacred tradition is of equal weight with the Bible. But the Catholics have done the same thing that the Jews did, and that is eventually the oral law becomes more authoritative than the written law. All right, so now you've got a 10-year-old boy that is studying the Pentateuch, and he's studying the Mishnah. By age 13, he would have his bar mitzvah. 2 words, B-A-R. The second word is spelled M-I-T-Z-V-A-H. Bar means son. Mitzvah means commandment. Son of the commandment, bar mitzvah. So you can see that when a boy became 13, they considered him to be accountable to the Mosaic law. He was now a son of the commandment and was a full-fledged member of the Jewish community. At age 15, he would start studying the Talmud. Now, what was the Talmud?
Greek literature or religious literature?
No? Commentary on the Old Testament. Considered of equal authority with the Old Testament. So basically, there were 3 collections of writings that a Jewish boy would be exposed to. The actual Hebrew scriptures, and then the Talmud, which was a commentary on the Old Testament, and then the Mishnah, which is what?
Commentary of the New Testament.
Mishnah's the one.
It's the oral law that was passed down, supposedly, from Moses to the elders from generation to generation, and then was eventually codified in the 1st century BC down through the 1st century AD. All right, by the time the boy became 18, he would probably be married. By the age of 20, he was expected to be an active merchant or tradesman, a businessman, fully involved in either the family business or in some trade or occupation that he started. All right, let's talk about the girls. Much briefer description of the girls, because from ages 1 through 10, she would immediately learn domestic duties. Caring for infants, delivering babies, learning how to cook and sew. You would expect a 10-year-old girl to be fully competent in all domestic duties, including child care,
Even delivering babies?
even delivering babies. Then, by age 11, you ready? She would typically be married.
Your next statement about that is the more troubling one for me.
Wait, what?
Is the more troubling one for me. Since you just said that the guys get married at 18.
Yeah. Guys married at 18 because they could support a family, but they did not want to miss any childbearing years with the girl. And there are some cultures today that think that Americans are very strange when girls getting married at 20 or 21 or 22, because in their way of looking at things, 9 childbearing years that were lost, forever lost. Well, the Jews that put a high value on large families basically wanted the girl, as soon as she was capable, to start producing children. So, our image of Mary is probably not correct. Rather, the image of Mary giving birth to Jesus, you're probably looking at a 13, 14-year-old girl. Is how old Mary was when she gave birth to Jesus. If she is typical of the age, and there's nothing that would indicate otherwise.
What if you're just not intellectually capable of doing what the men are supposed to do, the women are supposed to do? What would happen to you by your family or society?
That's where you hear about kind of the street people, the beggars. They did not have a system of like health care or even mental facilities at all.
Were families sympathetic if you had a kid? I mean, it would depend on the family, I suppose.
Yeah, but like even in John 9, the man that was born blind, he's still a beggar, but he's got parents that are not particularly taking care of him. And so it was a tough world. Really, the only communities were leper communities that they had, but other than that, it was tough if you were handicapped.
Hearing this statement puts an interesting light on the sermon that was presented Sunday morning about the age of individuals on the runway. I'm not saying that it's right. I don't agree with it at all. But if at that time girls were 11, 12, 13 when they were getting married, it makes you question the desire of why we would want younger and younger and younger girls
Yeah.
to be modeled.
Also, the girls would have what was called a Beth mitzvah, daughter of the commandment, at age 13.
You have spelling for that?
Beth.
So that would have been after she was married?
Yeah, it would be after she was married typically. The husband had the responsibility basically of, like she got married, he married her when she was 11 to spend 2 years in educating her on the ways of
Does that mean daughter of the commandment then?
Yeah, daughter of the commandment.
Sorry, daughter, is that what you said?
Yeah. All right, let's talk about death. Death was tragic among all peoples, but it was especially tragic among the Sadducees. Anybody know why?
In the resurrection.
Yeah, they did not believe in the resurrection. So, as a result, there was a horrible finality to the person when he or she would die. Now, there were a number of formal acts, and when I say formal acts, I mean you were basically expected to do these 4 things when there was a death in your family. First, you were to tear your garment. The Old English, rend your garment. That would indicate to others about a death of a loved one, that you were in mourning. Second, you would fast. Third, you would hire professional mourners. One of those things that I read when I was a kid that I never quite got was how Jesus could be saying, you have these people, this large throng of people that are mourning the death of a young girl, which is always tragic. And Jesus says, she's not dead, she's asleep, and they immediately start laughing. How did you flip that switch and go from mourning to laughing? Well, what I didn't know was that they're professionals. And so the mourning was all a put on, and they were paid to do that. Can you imagine, what do you do for a living? I'm a professional mourner. It's like, oh. There are cultures today that still do that. And then they would bury on the same day. Again, knowing that helps explain what seemed to be kind of a cold-hearted statement on the part of Jesus in Matthew chapter 8, when there is a man that comes to Jesus and said, Lord, I will follow you wherever you go, but allow me first to go and bury my father. Jesus said, let the dead bury their own dead. Come follow me. I'm thinking, wow. But what I didn't understand was that if the father had died, he'd be burying him right then. And he could follow Jesus the next day. But what he means is, let me take care of my ailing father until he dies. And then I'll come follow you. And Jesus is saying, in effect, there's not time for that. Let those who are spiritually dead bury those who physically die. We got work to do. And if that's what you want to do, then you need to let others take care of him and come follow me.
Where was that?
That's in Matthew chapter 8, verses 21 and 22.
Thank you.
Now, one other thing, just throw in, they would have a formal ceremony, a funeral ceremony, in which a professional orator would be hired to say a few words, very similar to what we do today. All right, next is religious groups. There were basically 3 categories of religious groups. One is what was called licensed religious groups. licensed religious group had the recognition and protection of the Roman government. Had the recognition and protection of the Roman government. Then there was a second group called the unlicensed religious groups. Now, in order to be classified in this category, you had to have been in existence before the Roman Empire became the world power.
What was the name of them?
The unlicensed.
Unlicensed.
That was in 167 BC. So any religious group that was in existence prior to 167 BC, the Roman government allowed to exist and worship according to their own laws if they were peaceful.
But they had no protection.
But they had no protection or no government recognition. All right, so Judaism fits in that category. They were in existence before the Roman takeover, and so the Romans, allowed them to stay in existence, but they didn't have any protection. And then a third religious group was what's called an illegal religious group.
What would they have to do to become licensed? Pay money?
It wasn't going to happen because only it was the state religion, the pagan.
Just emperor worship type stuff?
Yeah, emperor worship. All right, illegal religious groups were those that started after the Roman takeover. So anything after 167 BC was illegal, and they could be and were going to be persecuted, and all attempts made to eliminate this religious group. Now, when you study the New Testament and study history, you see that for the first couple of decades, the Roman government thought that Christianity was just sort of a subversive branch of Judaism. And so they really didn't pay much attention to Christians. But the Jews worked overtime to convince the Romans that this was a completely different, unrelated religious group to them. And when the Romans came to believe that to be the case, Christianity was illegal, and they were wide open for persecution, and persecuted they were. And of course, the Jews loved every minute of it. All right, let's talk about medicine. A lot of witch doctor type medicine. There were a few legitimate doctors like Luke, but he wouldn't have had much to work with.
What do you mean by that?
As far as their knowledge of the practice of medicine.
Okay.
Generally what happened is people got sick and died. This explains, then, why the miracles of Jesus created such interest. Because there was no hope of getting better, for the most part. But now you hear about a guy that can heal. Well, no wonder there were multitudes of people that made their way to Jesus, bringing him people that had all sorts of problems, sicknesses, illnesses, and so on. now we want to, before I do that, in your syllabus, I've got a breakdown of the religious groups of the first century. And we talk about the Pharisees and who they were, the Sadducees, who they were, the Sanhedrin, and who they were. So let's just briefly run through these groups that we're going to encounter as we study the New Testament. First of all, Pharisees is a group, it means separatists. They were separating themselves from the other religious elements of Jewish society. Now, you would get the impression that the Pharisees was a very large group, but according to Josephus, they only had about 6,000 members in the time of the first century. Pharisees believed in angels and demons. They believed in resurrection and an afterlife. And they accepted as authoritative all 39 books of the Old Testament. In the Hebrew Bible, that was just 22. Same material exactly, but they had it divided up differently. Sadducees. Sadducees were generally those from aristocratic families. They were the wealthy landowners. And as a result, they had a policy of cooperation with the Romans. They didn't want to rock the boat because they would lose their estates, their land, their homes, and their money. And so they tried to pacify the Romans best they could. The Sadducees were those who did not believe in the resurrection, or angels, or demons, or an afterlife. And they accepted as authoritative only the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So if you're going to talk doctrine with the Sadducee, you better come up with an argument out of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, or you're wasting your time. Now, because the Sadducees were so intimately connected with the temple, when the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees ceased to exist. Modern Judaism is the ancestor of the Pharisees. All right, we also have the Zealots. The Zealots were those that were 100% opposed to the Roman occupation. They wanted their nation to be free without having any sort of control or customs or taxes to be paid to those hated Romans.
Could you spell that, please?
Zealots. The Zealots had these knives that they would keep under their cloaks that had basically a 7 to 9 inch blade. It was called a Sicarii. And what they would do is when the Roman soldiers were walking up and down the streets of Jerusalem, and there would be a crowd they would whip out their Sicarii and they would stab the soldier in the back. And while he's lying there dying and bleeding, they'll just stick the knife back under their cloak and they'll merge in with the crowd. And the Romans got so tired of that was what eventually led to the destruction of Jerusalem. So the Zealots were responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70.
AD 70?
Yeah. All right, the notes talk about some others like Herodians and Essenes, which we'll not spend time talking about those now. But one other is the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a makeup of the religious leaders of the day. There were 70 esteemed members of this religious council. It was a combination of Pharisees and Sadducees, more Sadducees probably than Pharisees. And then the high priest was the leader of, or the head of the Sanhedrin. They were the ones that carried all of the religious clout and power during the days of Jesus. So when we read about the chief priests and elders, we're probably talking about members of the Sanhedrin. Okay, now let's talk specifically about Matthew. The goal of this book is to convince the Jew that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah. All right, so Matthew has, by inspiration, a very specific audience, a target audience, and that's Jews. Now, when you think about his mission to convince the Jew that Jesus was that prophesied Messiah, here is his plan. He's going to present the teachings of Jesus in large sections. And then in between those large sections, what I call speech sections, he's going to emphasize the works and the power of Jesus. Now, this is how Matthew goes about convincing the Jew that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah. First of all, he starts where every Jew would demand that you start, and that's with the lineage of Jesus, the genealogy, if you will. If you could not show that Jesus came from two main guys, Abraham and David, then the discussion was over. If he was not a descendant of David, then he could not be the Messiah. So Matthew starts out right from the beginning, establishing the genealogical record of Jesus, proving that he did go back through David and to Abraham. And then second plan of attack for Matthew is to talk about divine intervention into the affairs of men. they believed that when the Messiah was going to come, there was going to be a whirlwind of supernatural activities. And they got that from the Old Testament texts, like Isaiah 40 and Isaiah 11, other prophets. So it wasn't that they were making this up. So what we see in the early chapters of Matthew are a number of divine interventions through dreams. Matter of fact, in the first 2 chapters, there are going to be 5 times that Matthew tells us about individuals receiving dreams from God. And then also, besides dreams, the supernatural intervention will be seen in supernatural signs, like the moving star that the Magi followed in chapter 2. All right, so what we're talking about is how on earth was Matthew going to accomplish the goal? All right, first of all, genealogy. Second of all, through divine intervention. Now, third, through the fulfillment of Old Testament passages. Matthew is more Jewish than any other gospel. And, of course, he is. Because he's trying to convince the Jew that Jesus is the fulfillment of those Old Testament prophecies. So, Matthew is going to have the lion's share of quotations from Old Testament texts. He's going to establish how John the Baptist was the fulfillment of Old Testament prophetic passages, how Jesus was the fulfillment of Old Testament prophetic passages. As a matter of fact, Matthew is going to use a number of words when he's referring to these Old Testament prophecies. Sometimes he'll say that which was spoken through the prophet, or as was written by the prophet. And that is generally what we would call a single fulfillment prophecy. That Isaiah or Jeremiah or Zechariah, whoever it was, made the prophecy, and it only had a one-time fulfillment. So we call it a single fulfillment prophecy.
You got an example of that?
Yeah. Matthew 3 and verse 3, where this is the one referred to by Isaiah the prophet saying.
I think.
Matthew 2, 5 would be another example. But on 13 occasions, Matthew uses the word fulfilled. Fulfilled. And whenever he uses that word, that generally means that it is a dual fulfillment prophecy. A dual fulfillment prophecy. And that means that it had an initial fulfillment, maybe in an Old Testament context, but then a fuller fulfillment in the New Testament. All right, examples of this. If you look at Matthew chapter 2 and verse 15, he says, that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled, saying, out of Egypt did I call my son. Well, that's a quotation from Hosea 11 in verse 1. And its original fulfillment had to do with the Jews being freed from Babylonian captivity in 536 BC. But that prophecy had a fuller fulfillment, that's why it's called fulfill, in what happened in the days of Christ.
Would the Jews have been used to this idea, or would this have been totally new?
It would have been new. They wouldn't have been thinking of it that way.
What was that verse you said? Sorry.
Matthew 2:15. Matthew 2:17 and 18 is another example. Then that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, saying, and then he quotes from Jeremiah 31. It had an application in its day, a fulfillment, and then a fuller fulfillment in the days of Jesus.
You said it usually demonstrates a dual fulfillment. Are there times where it doesn't?
I'm kind of giving myself a little wiggle room. I don't think so. I think all of them are dual, out of all 13.
Put it down that you said so.
All right, the point, though, is that Matthew is trying to establish that Jesus is fulfilling these Old Testament prophecies. The Jews knew these prophecies. They studied these prophecies. And so it's logical that Matthew would try to say, all right, here's a prophecy, look at what happened. Here's a prophecy, look at what Jesus did. Here's another prophecy, look at what happened here. This would be very impressive evidence to the Jew to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. And then fourth is to establish the sinless nature of Jesus. Once the Jews understood the nature of the kingdom and of the Son, then and only then would they accept the qualification in order for the qualification of the builder. And so if Jesus was in fact a man that sinned like everyone else, they would not have deemed him authoritative enough to have replaced the law of Moses. So the sinless nature of Jesus is a very important part of the Gospel of Matthew. He is going to receive worship, and that's what qualifies him in Matthew 16 to build the church. Peter confessed, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, upon that rock, upon that confession that you just made, I will build my church. But unless he was the Christ, and unless he was the Son of God, he would not have been qualified to build anything. But having established himself as the Christ and the Son of God, Jesus said, okay, now I'm qualified to build my church. All right, and then the fifth approach of Matthew, and this is one of his primary ones because it takes the bulk of the text in Matthew, is to establish Jesus as the master teacher. Now, from various Old Testament texts, like Isaiah 11, Isaiah 40, and Isaiah 42, they expected the Messiah to be filled with the Spirit and to be one who was a powerful spokesman. Well, Matthew records, for example, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, what was the reaction? They were amazed. They hadn't heard anybody speak with this kind of power and authority. Well, That's what Matthew's trying to accomplish, to establish the fact that Jesus is the master teacher. Now, the way he's going to do that is by giving us 5 speech sections of Matthew. All right, everybody do this. Hold up your hand. How many fingers? Say it.
5.
How many speech sections? 5. When I ask you the question on the test, what are you going to say? 5. If anybody misses this question on the test on how many speech sections are in the Gospel of Matthew, then we are going to do something terrible. Yes.
No, what do you mean by speech section?
A large block of Jesus talking. Now,
Different from sermons?
sermons.
Okay.
Right, sermons. Now, look at the way Matthew does this. First of all, turn in your Bible to chapter 7, verse 28. Wayne, would you read that?
When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching.
All right. Now, with the rest of these, write the verses down, but don't turn to them. I just want you to listen to them read. So, Jack, chapter 11, verse 1. Yeah, go ahead.
When Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in their cities.
Okay, Rob, 13:53.
And he did not do many miracles there because of their unbelief.
Okay, no, 13:53.
Oh, 53. When Jesus had finished these parables, he departed from them.
Okay, now the other Rob, 19:1.
I forgot there's another Rob. I'm glad we didn't sing that to you. 19 what?
1.
When Jesus had finished these words, he departed from Galilee and came into the region of Judea beyond the Jordan.
Okay, Nathan, 26:1.
And it came about that when Jesus had finished all these words, he said to his disciples.
All right, did anybody notice a common refrain in all of those verses? Huh? Yeah, when Jesus had finished. Now, it could be when Jesus had finished these words, when Jesus had finished these parables, when Jesus had finished. But Matthew tells us every time a speech section is over, he always gives us a marker. Now, there was something, though, that was unique in 26:1 that was not in the other ones. Nathan, read it again.
And it came about that when Jesus had finished all these words, he said to his disciples.
Okay, what was different in that one?
He said to his disciples.
No?
All finished all.
He finished all these words. Matthew is telling us we're done with the speech sections. That was the last one. All right, so there are five speech sections in Matthew. And he identifies every single time that a speech section is over. So to the Jew, it would be important to establish the Messiah as a master teacher. They believed that the Messiah was going to be like Moses, Deuteronomy 18:15, and was going to be filled with the Spirit of the Lord, Isaiah 42:1-4. Now, when you look at that passage in Isaiah 42, it says that the Messiah was going to be filled with wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and strength, the spirit of knowledge, and he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Isaiah 11:2 and 3. So those two passages indicate why the Jews expected the Messiah to be such an incredible teacher. Well, so Matthew, who's trying to convince those Jews that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah, gives us these large blocks, 5 of them, of the teachings, the sermons of Jesus. Now, 2 major topics that are found in the speech sections. So, when Jesus is talking and preaching, what does he talk about? Well, one is almost a no-brainer. That is the kingdom. All the Jews are looking for the kingdom. And so, logically, Jesus is going to spend considerable time talking about the kingdom. As a matter of fact, the word kingdom occurs 56 times in the Gospel of Matthew.
You said these are going to be in all 5 of the speeches?
Yeah.
These 2 topics?
Now, the word kingdom is going to be found in all of its forms a total of 78 times. So it's really a predominant word. 56 of those times is used by Jesus. And 30 of those 56 times, you have a phrase, kingdom of heaven. Kingdom of heaven. Now, knowing what the Jews were looking for, why is the phrase kingdom of heaven significant?
Trying to distinguish from what they inside.
Yeah, what were the Jews looking for?
Physical kingdom.
Yeah, physical earthly kingdom. And so Jesus keeps talking about the kingdom of heaven. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about some physical earthly kingdom. And then the second topic that predominates in the teachings of Jesus is the Father. Talking about the Father. 61 times in the Gospel of Matthew do you have a reference to the Father. Now, here is what is up with that. There was a severely damaged relationship between God and the Jews. The Babylonian captivity, and then when they finally did return to the Promised Land, things never did get much better. As a matter of fact, there was a guy by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes that came and actually sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple in Jerusalem about 167 BC. And the Jews were always under Roman occupation. They never returned to the glory that they were expecting to have like they had during the days of Solomon. So, Jesus is trying to repair that damaged relationship, and the way that he does that is to get them to think about God as their Father. And so, you will frequently have Jesus make reference to the fact that God is their heavenly Father. 17 times in the Sermon on the Mount, you have a phrase, your Father in heaven. Your Father in heaven. 17 times just in the Sermon on the Mount.
Who was the guy that sacrificed the pig? He wasn't.
That was a Roman. Yeah, Antiochus Epiphanes was his name. You read about
Is he
him.
an official or something?
He was the king.
Oh, he was a king.
Yeah,
We read about him where?
in the book of Daniel.
Oh.
The abomination of desolation that Daniel refers to that's what Antiochus did.
Is that a topic that's in the 24th chapter also?
Yes, it is. All right, then the sixth plan of Matthew to convince the Jew that Jesus was the Messiah was through miraculous activity. Miracles. The predominant event that you're going to see in between the speech sections are miracles. Lots and lots of miracles. Now again, the Jews would have looked at those Old Testament texts like Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6, which, let me turn to that and read it to you. Isaiah 35, 5 and 6. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. The lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the dumb will shout for joy. For waters will break forth in the wilderness and streams in the Arabah. All right, when the Messiah comes. And then Isaiah 61 and verse 1. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives and freedom to prisoners. All right, so the Jews, especially the rabbis, looked at texts like Isaiah 35, like Isaiah 61, and believed that when the Messiah would come, he would be a miracle worker. So in between the speech sections, Matthew is going to talk a lot about the miracles of Jesus, proving that he had authority from God that was demonstrated through the miracles that he performed. All right, and then the seventh approach of Matthew is the fact that he would have many followers. Many followers. The Jews were skeptical by nature, and they were not going to be easily duped by some fly-by-night so-called Messiah. But Matthew records multitudes of people that followed Jesus from place to place. As a matter of fact, so many that on one occasion he fed 4,000 men apart from women and children. And then on another occasion, he fed 5,000 men apart from women and children. So if you believe that there were women and children there as well, how many were in the multitude? 10,000? 12,000? 15,000? Now, any skeptical Jew could easily either confirm or to deny the truthfulness of what Matthew's saying. I mean, if Matthew's saying there were 5,000 men that Jesus fed on that day, they would be able to find somebody that was there of that 5,000 men. And Matthew knows he's putting it out there. He's putting it out there and saying, check it out for yourself. And see that what I'm saying is true. The miracles of Jesus, the followers of Jesus, there were large crowds. Now, associated with that then are going to be three words that we see frequently in the text of Matthew. One is the word follow. 24 times you'll see the word follow in the text of Matthew. Second is the word disciple. A disciple is a follower. 72 times will we encounter the word disciple. And then a verb that is translated coming. 52 times Matthew is going to make reference to people coming. 38 of those times they're coming to Jesus. So we have basically a cycle that Matthew has given us that is repeated again and again. And that is that you'll have teaching that is followed by miracles that creates followers that he teaches. But his teaching rocks their world. And they're not so sure that they want to keep following. But then he does miracles. And so they're going, let's stay with this guy a little bit longer. And so they keep following. And then he teaches them again. And then miracles confirm the teachings. And so that cycle continues through the Gospel of Matthew. We read about, though, like in chapter 13, people that they break the cycle. He starts teaching in parables. It's nonsense to them. And so they make a determination, I'm out of here. I'm not following anymore. Well, Jesus is doing that on purpose. Trying to weed out the truth seekers from the non-truth seekers. Okay, we are ready now to begin the text of Matthew.
That was a good warm-up. Good.
Yeah.
What's the date for this?
The date is around 53 to 55.
For everything we just covered?
For when Matthew wrote the Gospel.
You say 53 to 85?
53 to 55. I may have said 85, but 55. You'll find some that dated as early as 45, but most scholars have it in the early 50s.
Do you think this is the first gospel written?
I do. Yeah. You know, the liberals think Mark was, but they've got an agenda for that. All right, so what does Matthew do? He begins by saying the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, there are different ways that you could look at verse 1, but the way I look at it is Matthew's just putting it out there. He's not trying to throw a bunch of information at the Jews, and then later on they go, oh, so what you were really trying to do is to prove that Jesus was the Messiah? Matthew's not playing games. In verse 1, this is about Jesus the Christ. Remember, the word Christ means Messiah. It's not his last name. Jesus is the Christ. All right, so let me give you the genealogy of the Christ. And who were the two main guys? David, Abraham. All right, so we start working our way from Abraham to Isaac, Jacob, and on down. If you drop down to verse 6, and to Jesse was born David the king, and then David was born Solomon, and then if you work your way down, verse 16, And to Jacob was born Joseph, the husband of Mary, whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. All right, so he lays it out there. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, to a Jew, if without establishing the genealogy, then you're not even going to get to first base. You've got to prove that first. Well, Matthew knows that. He's a Jew too. And so what he does is he, in the genealogy, connects Jesus to both of these Old Testament characters. Now, you also note that there are 4 women that are mentioned in the genealogy. You've got Tamar, verse 4, Rahab, verse 5, Ruth, verse 5, then Mary, verse 16. And then there is a 5th woman who is referred to but not by name, and that's Bathsheba in verse 6. The text says, and to David was born Solomon by her, who had been the wife of Uriah. So that means then that there are 5 women referred to. And what's interesting is the character and reputation and nationality of these women. Now, we don't have the time to go back and study the indiscretions of a Tamar and a Rahab, who was a prostitute. Ruth was a Moabitess. She wasn't even a Jewish woman, but she was in the lineage of Jesus. Bathsheba committed adultery with David. But what we learn from the genealogy is the importance of all people in the plan of God, and including the importance of women in the gospel plan. Even if they had somewhat of a sordid past, God used these women for great things. And so there's a lesson that can be learned from that by just looking at the names of those in the genealogy. All right, then, in verse 17, something to us, we blow right by it when we read the Gospel of Matthew, but to a Jew, there's something really significant going on. And that is that the genealogy was broken down into 3 groups of 14. From Abraham to David, you had 14 generations. I'm looking at verse 17. From Abraham to David, 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the time of Christ, 14 generations. All right, after chapel, we'll explain the significance of that.